Hello everyone, I hope you're keeping well. My name is Barry Lacey and I am the historian in residence with Wexford County Council's Library and Archive Service as part of their Decade of Centenaries. And today I'm going to be bringing you a talk which is called The Transfer of Power in County Wexford in 1922. So what's going to be the topic of discussion today? Well, we're going to be talking about the months that immediately followed the ratification of the Anglo Irish Treaty in January 1922 that would see the disbandment and evacuation of RIC and British forces from the country, to be replaced eventually by the forces of the newly established Free State. Now, for many, the prospect of peace was very much welcomed, with one such element being the release of prisoners whom had previously been interned during the War of Independence. However, the terms of the treaty still caused much debate, and from January to June, tensions gradually increased, eventually culminating in a terrible civil war. And this account will focus on the initial reaction to the treaty and how the country dealt with the departure of British forces, the RIC disbandment, and the unrest and division that was to come in the early months of 1922. Now, to get a better understanding of public support for the treaty, one resource we can use is the newspapers from the time. So in the week or two prior to its ratification in early January, the newspapers would have reported on the views of the county council, the urban and district councils, and as well as local groups. So one such example is from the New Ross Standard, and it was reporting on the Wexford Farmers County Union. And in the meeting regarding the treaty, they cited the economic benefits of peace times. And also during this meeting, a Colonel Gibbon of Schledaw spoke, stating that he was brought up in the Unionist tradition, but felt that he spoke for many Southern Unionists in that they would be supportive of the treaty and the new government. Now, they also reported on the South Wexford Sinn Féin executive, and I have a quote here on the screen where it said that the delegates, with 2 or 3 exceptions, then reported that the vast majority of people in their various districts were in favour of ratification of the treaty, not indeed as a fulfilment of their lifelong aspirations, but as a foundation on which the prosperity and future independence of the nation could be built, and as the only means of preventing national dissonation and chaos. So what they're essentially, from that you can gather, is that while they realised that the treaty didn't bring the full prospects and benefits of what they initially set out for, it was a way of avoiding further conflict and chaos, and it was possibly something that they could build on. An analysis of the newspapers of the time also shows that some people were fearful of the direction that the vote on the treaty would lead the country. We can see an example of this from a meeting of New Ross District Council. It was a special meeting which was held to discuss the treaty just before its ratification. So this was the lead up to the vote on it. And the members voiced their concern against the divisions and the directions in which it could lead the country. So there was a lot of worry about in people's minds at the time, and some people were undecided. An example being the Gorey District Council, which again, following a special meeting on the treaty just before its ratification, it was proposed and accepted that no action would be taken on the matter. So while I spoke earlier that the discussion on the treaty was for or against, there was also other thoughts playing on people's minds. They were fearful and worried about what way would lead the country, and some people, probably because of that and other reasons, were just undecided as of yet. Now, another resource we can look at to get an idea of opinion is the Wexford County Council minute books, and these are available to view freely online on the Wexford County Archive webpage. And on the morning of the 31st of December, and prior to the ratification of the treaty, a special meeting was called following representation from several councillors to consider the treaty, and they believed it was advisable to adopt a resolution on it. Now, those named as being present were a John J. O'Byrne, Philip Lennon, John Pender, James Hall, Michael Redmond, John Sinnott, E.P. Foley, Michael Doyle, Michael Cloney, C. McCarthy, John Murphy, C. Culleton, Michael Doyle, and finally a David Kavanagh. And after discussion, the resolution, which you can see on the screen, was passed. And if we analyse this, we can get an idea of their thinking. So the first section states that we, the Wexford County Council, while recognising that the peace pact between Ireland and England does not confer full independence upon our country, realise that it does confer a working measure of freedom, which is acceptable for the present, and for this reason we are of opinion its provisions should be ratified by us all. So from this we can gather that they recognise that it's not full fulfilment of their original ideals, but that does give some measure of freedom, which is acceptable for the present. And you can gather by that last bit of language that they probably see it as only being temporary. The second section says that we call upon our Wexford representatives to and all to support the treaty and thus voice the opinions of the vast majority of the people of the county. So it states that they call upon the Wexford representatives, so the 4 TDs in the Dáil, to support the treaty, and they see that support of the treaty is the opinion of the vast majority of the people of County Wexford. Now, the final section states that the rejection of the treaty can produce only chaos in a divided country, and in view of the vital issues involved, we appeal to our deputies to vote unanimously for ratification as the best and wisest course to adopt in the interests of Ireland and as the consideration which should outweigh all others. So they see that rejection of the treaty could only produce chaos and a divided country. So that's another reason why it should be passed. So 3 things we can gather from this. The first is that they see that's not a full fulfilment of their original ideals, but it does give some working measure of freedom, which they see as perhaps only temporary. They see that support for the treaty is the opinion of the vast majority of the people of County Wexford, and that finally that rejection can only lead to chaos and further division. Or apologies, not further division, but that it would lead to division rather. And the minutes go on to state that the resolution was then put forward by the chairman and carried with the exception of a single person being Mr. J. Murphy, and it was decided to forward copies of the resolution onto the 4 Wexford TDs, as well as the President Damon de Valera, Mr. Arthur Griffith, and the Director of Publicity Department of Dáil Éireann. Now, in addition to this, a following resolution was also passed that we, the members of Wexford County Council, consider the attacks which have been made on our national leaders in the Irish daily press and entirely unwarranted and deserving of the strongest condemnation of the Irish people. So obviously there is some conflict of opinion with regarding some aspects of the press there as well. Now, while the newspapers and council voiced their support for the treaty, there were those who disagreed. One such example being that of Dr. Ryan. Now, he had previously been elected as a Sinn Féin candidate for County Wexford in the 1918 election, and he did not agree with the treaty and subsequently resigned from his posts within the council. In a meeting held on the 4th of February, Dr. Ryan, under the date of a letter written on the 12th of January, resigned his membership of the Public Health Board owing to a certain resolution which the council adopted. You can imagine that's probably the one we just spoke of, and more especially because of some remarks which were made at the same meeting. The council adopted a resolution asking that Dr. Ryan reconsider his recognition. Now, further to this, on the 1st of March, the resignation of Dr. Ryan was again discussed when a letter from him dated the 16th of February stated that after reconsidering his resignation, he came to the same conclusion and therefore stood by his decision to resign from the county board. He also realised that he was still a member of both the county insurance and tuberculosis committees, and he tendered his resignation from both, and that this was accepted by the county council. So you can see that Dr. Ryan did not agree with the treaty, and he resigned his posts within the county council because of that, or rather because of the resolution that was passed and of the reasons we just spoke of. While analysing the minute books, we can see the religious influence which the Catholic Church would have held on members of society at the time, when upon the death of the Pope Benedict XV, Mr. McCarthy proposed that owing to his death of His Holiness, that as a mark of respect they would adjourn the business of the meeting for a week. This was seconded and it was passed unanimously by members of the council, and no business was discussed at the January the 25th council meeting as a mark of respect, and instead they decided to postpone the business for a week. And it's just interesting to note the religious influence which the church would have held on members of society at the time, which was during an important period in Irish history. Now, in the months following the ratification of the treaty, rallies both for and against were held nationally and throughout the county. Pro-treaty meetings were held in several locations in North Wexford, including Bunclody, Kilrush, Enniscorthy and Ferns. Now, while many of these passed off peacefully, some elements attempted to cause disruption and intimidation. An example of this is following a pro-treaty meeting in Enniscorthy, where one of the speakers, by the name of Mr. W. O'Reilly from Dublin, was arrested while in his hotel by the anti-treaty IRA, who then occupied the town's courthouse. He was taken there in connection to a statement he had made at the speech, but was released later on that night. Also, in that same newspaper, it's noted that a pressman, which I would imagine is a journalist, was also temporarily held. Similarly, in another event, a man by the name of W.J. Brendan Whitmore, who was a reporter with the Enniscorthy Echo, was arrested on Wednesday, the 19th of April at Gorey by anti-treaty IRA and detained in the town's barracks. Now, he had presided over a pro-treaty meeting at Ferns the previous Sunday, and he was charged with using remarks which it was alleged reflected on some of the brigade officers when he spoke at the meeting. So here we have examples of interference or intimidation within the public rallies when they're trying to sway people's opinions. And it's just a case or a pretext to what was going to come in the lead up to the Civil War. Some of these pro and anti-treaty rallies attracted famous figures in County Wexford. One such example was that of Eamon de Valera when he visited Enniscorthy town on the 17th of April for a rally against the treaty. And the details are very interesting. And if you go through them, it says that he addressed a meeting in the market square in Enniscorthy, so a very public location, prominent location, and he arrived in the town by motor car that morning and attended a conference of Cumann in the Athenaeum. So again, as well as being a likely location, practically it was probably also symbolic, as it was the headquarters of the Irish Volunteers in the town in 1916. A large crowd of volunteers in Cumann who had sworn allegiance to the executive escorted him from his hotel to the market square, where he addressed the crowd from a small wagonette beside the 98 monument. Interestingly, here he dressed them from a small wagonette, not a huge platform, but because it was beside the 98 monument, that was also a prominent thing. He would have stood beside a monument which would have had a lot of importance and appeal to people in the town. And interestingly, a figure, it says, Miss Kay Moran from Church Street opened the address by welcoming him in Irish. The Morans were a very well-known Republican family during the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence, and from Church Street in Enniscorthy. And it also says Dr. Ryan, who we spoke of earlier, and Sean Etchingham were some of those also in attendance. Now, earlier that month, another prominent figure had visited Wexford town for a pro-treaty rally. This was Michael Collins, and he arrived in the town on the 11th of April and gave a speech in favour of the treaty. Now, attempts were made to halt the Dublin to Wexford train on which he was due to travel. He was halted at Arklow and in Enniscorthy, with in the case of the latter, and the engine driver was actually kidnapped by armed men and taken away. However, their attempts to disrupt Collins' speech failed, as it later transpired that he had actually arrived in Wexford the day before, and you can actually see a photograph of him here on the left-hand side of the screen. One positive aspect in early 1922 was the release of people who had been imprisoned previously during the War of Independence. This took place in many parts of the country and was accompanied by joyous celebrations. In County Wexford, some of these examples include the release of a man by the name of Thomas Furlong from Adamstown, who was arrested following a post office raid in New Ross in the summer of 1921. Elsewhere, two men named Aidan Kane and Philip Murphy were met at Ryland Road, Bunclody, by music and songs. Both had been imprisoned for 18 months previously without charge. On the 3rd of February, though, probably one of the most prominent returns of prisoners took place in County Wexford, when 6 survivors of the salt mill explosion were released from Dartmoor prison in England. This incident, the salt mill explosion, occurred in October 1920, and it was the single largest loss of life in County Wexford during the War of Independence, resulting in 5 dead volunteers and 9 injured. While 3 of the latter managed to escape and go on the run, The remaining survivors were arrested and later imprisoned. And in a book called A Wexford Childhood by a woman by the name of Mary Finn, she fondly recalls the men's return to Salt Mills, and she states, "The freeing of the men in jail was looked to immensely. Their homecoming was a great celebration. There were bonfires in many places. Mrs. Brown of Garrycullen made a homecoming cake. She told us to go up to the crossroads, and when the men would come, she would cut the cake. We all waited for hours. We could not hear the train coming up the line to Ballycullen and were disappointed. Mrs. Brown told us to come to her house and she would cut the cake at 11 o'clock. The men arrived at Ballycullen station 12 hours later than expected. Their late arrival did not dampen the wonderful welcome which awaited them." And you can see a photograph here which was supposedly taken upon the men's release from Dartmoor prison a year later after the event had taken place. So a very joyous occasion for people in the county, in particular in Salt Mills. Now, one of the more tangible aspects of the treaty witnessed by ordinary people was the disbandment of the Royal Irish Constabulary, which had been in existence since the early 19th century as the country's police force. And from early February 1922, various barracks throughout the county were vacated and transferred to the IRA. Now, during their disbandment, the county hall in Wexford town was utilised as a concentration depot by the RIC, and this, however, caused conflict with the county council, who had sought to occupy the building. And in a meeting held on the 1st of March, they voiced their anger that County Hall had not been returned to them for use. In response from the Minister for Home Affairs, to whom they had previously complained to about the matter, it was stated the hall was currently being used as part of the disbandment, and it was to be vacated by the RIC in about 3 weeks. The council had suggested that the RIC be moved to Wexford Military Barracks instead, but the minister replied that this wasn't possible as the IRA were already in occupation of it. And in response, a resolution was passed stating they were dissatisfied with the reply from the minister and that they couldn't continue to undertake their business in a disused ward of Wexford Workhouse. Now, the council had highlighted the deplorable conditions in which they were expected to operate, making note of broken typewriters and the covers of valuable books falling apart. And they considered it extraordinary that the convenience of the police was being considered before that of the council staff. And the RIC eventually evacuated the county hall on the 11th of March, and it was subsequently taken over by the IRA and was given for the council to move in. It appears, though, that the building was not left in a desirable condition, as it was described as being in a very dirty condition, and it was looked to have it cleaned and the furniture and records brought back to the former offices. Now, a resolution was passed by the council that a man by the name of John Roach, the caretaker, would move into the premises, and his salary was to remain the same as when the council had first been evicted from there, and that the county surveyor was to have the place washed out and the council staff moved back in as soon as possible. Now, one of the more tangible aspects of the treaty was the withdrawal of British forces from Ireland, and also the disbandment of the Royal Irish Constabulary. And in County Wexford, there was only a handful of these barracks still operational, mostly based in towns, so Gorey, Enniscorthy, New Ross and Wexford. Wexford also had military barracks, and there was a barracks operational in Rosslare. Now, Rosslare wasn't a major town, but it was an important port, and that's why there was still a garrison placed there. And you can see a list of the various barracks and the dates that they were taken over on the right hand side of the screen. And the first major event really was on the 6th of February when the IRA occupied New Ross Courthouse. And interestingly, this was directly opposite the RIC barracks, which was still garrisoned and still had police inside of it. And they would have watched on as the IRA arrived in, it was described that they arrived inside the town, officers and other men with lorries and in cars. There was a large flag displayed in one of the cars, so this would have been a sight to behold coming through the street, especially from the RIC's point of view. And when they occupied the courthouse the next day, they raised the tricolour flag. So this was really making a statement. On the 11th of February, Wexford Military Barracks was taken over, and this occasion was marked by a procession and by the flying of the tricolour. You can see an article here on the right hand side, on the left hand side of the screen, which details it. And of course, the heading says Triumphal March Through Town. So members of the South Wexford Brigade IRA gathered at Ferrycarrick, a short distance outside of Wexford town, and they marched all the way into the town, through the streets and into the barracks. And again, the tricolour was raised. And also, as is the case with the New Ross takeover, as was the case with the takeover of the courthouse, or the occupation rather, of the courthouse in New Ross, the New Ross O'Hanrahan Pipers Band were also present and headed the line of men that would have marched into the barracks in Wexford as well. And we're going to have a look at some of the other barracks that were taken over now. Now, after the takeover of Wexford Military Barracks, the next barrack building to be handed over was in Rosslare Pier. And you can see it's detailed here in an article from the Echo newspaper dated on the 25th of February 1922. And the heading says demobilisation of RIC, and it goes on to say that preparatory to their demobilisation, the RIC are being withdrawn to the main county barracks. Those stationed at Rosslare Pier were withdrawn to Wexford RIC Barracks on Monday. On the same day, the barracks was formally handed over to the commanding officer IRA, Barracks Wexford. It will be recalled that a determined but unsuccessful attack, which lasted for several hours, was made by Republican troops on this elaborately fortified barrack last year. And that made reference to an attack by the local IRA in the barracks during the War of Independence. Now, following the handover of Rosslare, the next RIC barracks to be taken over was at New Ross Town. And this was taken over by members of the South Wexford Brigade IRA in a fairly large display, similar to Wexford Military Barracks, but unlike that of Rosslare. So members of the South Wexford Brigade IRA gathered in the showgrounds and marched through the town and in front of the RIC Barracks, where it was taken over, and the tricolour was raised. And interestingly, if you read newspaper reports from the time concerning it, one states that the RIC left their beds and bedding behind them, but that they took their rifles with them. So New Ross stands out in that it was together with Wexford Military Barracks were the only takeovers which had formal displays. And what I mean by that, it was parades, bands, the O'Hanrahan Pipe Band, and the raising of the tricolour. In comparison to this, Rosslare, New Ross, and Gorey were a lot more simpler occasions. And we're going to take a look at Enniscorthy and New Ross now. So after the takeover of New Ross RIC Barracks, Enniscorthy and then Gorey were next. And these were very simplistic events, as you'll see detailed here in the newspaper article from the Echo on the 1st of March 1922. The RIC cleared out and departed the building in early March, and it was taken over shortly after by members of the IRA. You can see here on the right hand side of the screen, it details how it was taken over by members of the IRA from the local RIC district inspector. So unlike New Ross and Wexford, there was no raising of the tricolour, and there was also no band or large crowd, it seems, looked on, which is interesting considering that Enniscorthy had a long history from 1798 to 1916, so a lot of nationalist pride in the town. One would have thought it would have been a very formal event, but as the newspapers detail, this wasn't the case. And finally, the takeover of Gorey RIC Barracks. Again, like in Enniscorthy, this was a fairly simplistic event where members of the RIC left, and it was handed over. The keys were handed over to the caretaker in this case, which in turn were given to members of the IRA. But an interesting account is given in the Free Press on the 11th of March, and it says that all records and documents appear to have been burned, but one was picked up dealing with a charge of one constable against another for stealing of 2 rashers of bacon. And it goes on to say that many articles seized during raids throughout the district were left behind. And these are interesting because it notes some of them were several guns of the antique pattern, as well as shotguns and kilts, the property of members of the Gorey's Piper Band. Now, following the disbandment of the Royal Irish Constabulary, many of its members would join the Civic Guard in the south, the RIC, the RUC in the north, or others would simply immigrate or take retirement. But despite the orderly and peaceful disbandment, however, former constables did experience intimidation. And we see examples of this in County Wexford. You can see in an article on the left-hand side of the screen, it details how former members of the RIC or the disbanded RIC were ordered to clear out, and that some of them actually did depart, and this included pensioners as well. And similarly, 5 or 6 disbanded RIC men in Duncannon had received notices to clear out and also left the district. And one case in particular is highlighted when in a meeting of New Ross Urban Council, it concerned a former constable by the name of Mr. Peter Higgins, who lived in William Street. Now, he was, from what I can gather, a retired member of the RIC, so he had probably been left the force several years before. But the man had been attendant of the council for several years, but he was attacked by masked and armed men in order that someone else could get his house. And a motion was passed that the military should hold an inquiry into the matter. So despite the peaceful disbandment, there were cases of intimidation for members of the disbanded RIC, and also for many who had been retired for years previously, who probably had no involvement in the War of Independence whatsoever. Following the disbandment of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Provisional Government set about establishing a civic guard that would later become known as An Garda Síochána. The divisions created in the months leading up to the Civil War, however, meant the delayed deployment of the force, and this coincided with a rise in crime, with numerous raids on private property, banks, trains, as well as agrarian disputes and evictions highlighted in the local newspapers. The delay in the deployment of a civic guard, though, necessitated the council to feel compelled to act and consider the establishment of a county police force. In a meeting held on the 29th of May 1922, the council heard a report from a conference held in the county hall earlier on the 22nd of that same month regarding the establishment of a county police force. The conference was attended by members of the county, rural, district and urban councils, as well as the Republican courts. And following on from the meeting, communications with the Minister for Defence indicated that policing would be done by the Army until such a police force was established, which they thought would be soon. This was not seen as favourable though by the council chairman, and a resolution was adopted instead that set about a particular amount of funding for the establishment of a local police force. In a further meeting on the 22nd of June 1922, the council passed a resolution that the scheme go ahead and that an executive panel be appointed to oversee its establishment, followed by a police board when the force was operational. A further subcommittee was formed to draft particulars for the scheme, and we will discuss some of those here now. And we can see a couple of these particulars set out here now. So it said that recruits were to be men who had served in the Republican Police or were IRA members prior to the truce of July 1921. That they would be at least 5 foot 8 inches height and be between the ages of 21 and 35. Their pay would be £2.10 per week, and superintendents would receive £3 per week. Candidates needed to be able to pass a simple Irish, English and arithmetic exam, and their character was important, and a reference from their last employer and a certificate of character from the clergyman of the district and from the officer commanding of the brigade area was required. And it was decided that the new force would be placed in charge of Mr. Orson, who was the divisional police officer, and they were to be summoned on the 21st of June to interview the recruits. Also, an opinion was expressed that it would be advisable to recruit the new force from the Irish Republican Police. The council adopted these minutes except regarding the numeration, which was increased to £3 per man and £3.10 for superintendent, which was also to include mess. Now, as well as the county council, individual towns had considered similar ideas of establishing their own police forces. One example is from Wexford town. In early April 1922, at a meeting of the Wexford Corporation, the town's mayor summoned property owners in the town to consider the establishment and funding of a civic police force to patrol the town night and day. It was noted that if the meeting was successful, it would remove a lot of uneasiness from the minds of the people. So it's from this you can gather that there was some unrest in the members of the public in the town. And similarly, a civic guard was to be formed in Ross from 6 nominated members of the IRA that currently occupy the barracks. The Chamber of Commerce was to collect the money and fund them directly. When someone asked, though, how many are currently doing duty, they were told none, and that was the reason for the increase in the robberies. So again, we can see the disbandment of the RIC left a void with regards to law and order policing. And in a July meeting of the county council, however, it was decided to postpone the establishment of the police force, and we're going to look at that now. Now, at the outbreak of civil war in July 1922, the county council decided to postpone the establishment of a police force for the county. And you can see this here described in the county council minutes displayed on the screen. The heading says Proposed County Council Police, and the text states, the chairman considered that in view of the present condition of the county, no useful purpose would be served by dealing with the proposed establishment of a county police force. And he moved that the question of the visit of the county council's deputation to the Minister for Local Government be postponed for the present. And it was agreed to, and it was decided that the Secretary asked Brigadier Keogh, who is in charge of the national troops, if he intends on doing anything to provide a temporary police force. So you can see it was obviously on the council's mind how were they going to keep law and order in these troubled times if they couldn't establish a police force themselves. And due to the violence of the Civil War, it wasn't possible for them to establish one. And that marks the end of this talk, folks, regarding the transfer of power in County Wexford as headed. And I hope you have enjoyed the talk very much. And if you would like any other information regarding the Wexford Library and the Decade of Centenaries, you can visit their webpage. Also, Wexford County Council's archive webpage also has all of the County Council meetings on it. And this and other resources regarding this talk are available at the very end. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again. And until then, good luck and goodbye.